Hello, and you're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. In terms of water quality, we know that Ireland's farmers play a critical role in improving water quality, and they're increasingly adopting sustainable practices to mitigate agricultural runoff and safeguard our aquatic ecosystems. And today we'll be talking about managing the farm during the winter time in particular. And we're delighted to be joined by Fiona Doolan, who is an advisor to the Agricultural Sustainability Support Programme with Teagasc. Good morning, Fiona. You're very welcome to the 233rd webinar, I'm told, this morning. So we're delighted to have you today.
Thanks, Mark.
And this is your first webinar. I thought we had you before, but no, this is your first. But could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in the ASSAP program?
Yeah, sure. When ASSAP began in 2018, Mark, I was lucky enough to get the role of ASSAP Advisor in the Kildare-Laois area. And at the time, I felt it was a really exciting role to become involved in. So rather than talking about all the negatives that were out there and all the conversation about things that are wrong, here was a role that involved engaging with farmers, providing advice and support to them to improve things. So talking about what is achievable, helping them to put measures in place to address any issues that might be out there. And basically that's been a very rewarding role for the past 6 years, because there's a real a desire, I think, on farmers' behalf at the minute to do everything they can do to improve water quality.
So there's
That's the role of an ASSAP advisor.
a significant mindset change there by farmers, by the sounds of it.
Hugely so. Over that past 6 years, I think we've really seen a massive change in attitude. There's a real will and a desire, as I said, to address this, give us solutions is what farmers are looking for. So ASSAP advisors, together with other professionals and industry, are really trying to put measures in place on farm that will make a difference, rather than just talking about the negative, as I said, to really get involved, put the shoulder to the wheel, and let's see some improvements.
Because there are a lot of agencies involved in water quality in Ireland, and I suppose it's good to have that sort of contact point for farmers to try and make sense of some of those different regulations and different asks that are coming from those different agencies.
Yeah, there are, like a lot of areas of life, there are a lot of different players, a lot of different people who are all doing really good work. But I suppose what the ASSAP advisor provides differently to farmers is that it's a voluntary service, really. We're not forcing a farmer to engage with it. That said, over 96% of farmers approached by an ASSAP advisor have allowed a farm assessment to take place and got involved in the process. But it's also a free and a confidential service, which I think is really important too if we want to make improvements. It's having that trust, it's building those relationships with farmers that they feel, yes, here's something that I can really use to address things. And not everything will be addressed overnight. ASSAP advisors understand that, but it's getting a plan in place that at least we can see progress over a couple of months, couple of years, whatever it takes, but we're going the right direction.
Excellent. Thanks, Fiona. Really looking forward to your presentation. We have Noel Meehan, who is the head of the Agricultural Sustainability Support Programme, who's going to be helping us with questions this morning. Noel, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mark. Morning, Fiona, and to the listeners. I'm helping out with the questions this morning. So just maybe to remind our listeners, there's a Q&A tab there. Please put in your questions into the Q&A tab, and we'll get through as many as we can between once Fiona's finished and into the webinar. So make sure you put the questions in, please. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. We always enjoy the questions and answers at the end. It just leads for nice discussion, and so we do rely on our viewers for those questions. Just to remind everyone that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel, as well as the podcast on all of the popular podcast platforms. And of course, Fiona's presentation will also be available on the Teagasc website. So Fiona, we'll ask you to share your slides with us, and we will take some questions afterwards then. So that is
perfect.
Yeah, that looks good.
Lovely. Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. And as Mark said, my presentation today is going to be on managing our farms and farmland this winter. I suppose I took the opportunity with the first slide to put up a nice on a weekend where we have a storm warning and it's looking very grey and wet outside, to think back to our summer, the summer days, and to remember that summer will come again. But also, I suppose, on a serious note, to mention that, a lot of the things that happen on our farms next summer are dictated by the decisions that we make on farm this winter. So, while the seasons don't work independently of one another, and the decisions we make now in farmyards will directly impact what happens in early spring and summer of next year. I suppose just to give a small bit on the agenda, what I'd hope to cover today, I suppose it's just firstly to mention the Better Farming for Water campaign, and to go through, there are 8 actions for change there in that campaign, and I want to see how they can integrate into the management and the things we can do on farm at the minute, and see both in our farm yards, where we're really focused at the minute, but also out in the land as well. I think it's really good time to remind ourselves of what we need to be aware of in farmyards and on farms at the minute, what we need to be cognizant of, what to look for. Just reminders there, very important to remind ourselves of, the really important and critical areas, and also potentially how to manage those. And okay, we're in the middle of winter at the minute, but there still are things we can do. It's not all about things that have to wait for 6 months or 12 months or, down the road. There are things we can do at the minute that will, really make a difference in terms of reducing losses from our farms and hopefully seeing an improvement in water quality. Because as I said at the start, that's really, I feel, what everyone wants to do. So hopefully today's talk will give a few pointers on how we can achieve that. A lot of the presentation today that I'm going to give will be based around pictures and photographs, because I think it's important to visualize what we're talking about. So rather than a lot of text, I'd hope to use a lot of visual images to focus the mind on things that we can change, can do, and that are possible at the minute. So to take into the presentation itself, just a reminder that we do have a Better Farming for Water campaign launched earlier this year. It's a whole of industry approach to improving water quality between now and 2030. It involves all of the stakeholders, all of the agencies, the farmer representative organisations, all the various different enterprise and processors, and the greater agri-food industry, as a push together to get a coherent campaign on the ground to actually see changes. And I suppose one of the things that we can look to is there is a blueprint within that campaign to get change. 8 actions for change. And it's not just 8 actions, it's 8 actions that will actually lead to improvement if we can see our way to practicing the measures that are there. And those 8 actions are divided over 3 different areas on our farms. So they deal with nutrient management, they deal with farmyard management, and they deal with land management. And okay, some are probably more relevant at different stages of the year than they are on the 6th of December here now. But at the same time, it's important, I think, to look at them, remind ourselves of them, and see where they fit into the management that's going on our farms today. So in terms of nutrient management, the first of the 8 actions is about reducing purchased chemical nitrogen surplus on the farm. And you might say, well, what's that got to do with the middle of December? But it's all got to do with how we manage and store the organic manures that are on our farms and how we use them to the maximum efficiency we possibly can next year, because that's how we'll reduce our chemical nitrogen input. Even, our action number 2 is about ensuring soil fertility is optimum on the farm. Again, the first nutrient that we have available is what's produced on the farm. So how we deal and manage with it plays a real part in how we rectify any soil fertility problems. And of course, number 3 is critical. The application of those fertilizer and organic manures at appropriate times and conditions. Again, that's what I meant at the start when I said what we do next year is directly impacted by how we manage and store those nutrients now, so that we can use them when we want to, where we want to get the maximum result next year. A lot of today's presentation will be about farmyard management and, the two actions, action number 4 and 5, about having sufficient slurry and soil water storage. I'll go into that in a moment. It's obvious how that can impact negatively or positively on water quality, whatever way you want to look at it. But also action number 5 about minimizing nutrient loss from both our farmyards and our roadways. And that's an area I think visually, when I show a few slides later on, it'll be important to get us thinking about that. And it's the last of the actions for change around land management, how we manage the land that is under our control. Action 6 is about fencing off water courses. Action 7 is about the riparian margins along all the water courses on our farms, how we reduce losses through those, and also how we reduce things like sediment loss, manage, practices that we can put in place, and I'll deal with those in a minute. And the 8th, I suppose, cover crops. It's on tillage farms. It's not that we're asking you to go out and sow a cover crop in the middle of December, but now is about maybe how they're managed and looking at the benefits that they're providing. So I'm going to try to tie those 6 actions in as we go, 8 actions in as we go along the presentation today, because they really do offer us a really good blueprint or pathway to improving water quality. And I suppose to get into the presentation, if we are here on the the 6th of December and a storm warning in place, every farmyard in the country, regardless of enterprise or intensity or system of farming, will have some or all of these different areas to manage. That makes sense. There's slurry or farmyard manure storage there. There's some degree of soil water, possibly on most yards. There's effluent control in a lot of yards to be taken care of. In all yards, there will be clean water. There will be clean roof water in particular, how we manage that. And then ultimately, really importantly, there's how that farmyard is connected to the surface water network, the surface drain network that's around the farmyard. And I think if we really thought about, the weather forecast, for example, that we have for the weekend, the huge rainfall that's predicted and the weather conditions, if you think about the yards that are out there, is there a clear separation in place between all of those things? So is it clearly defined where our slurry is produced and stored? Is it clearly defined where our soiled water is? Or are they all murking in together into one? Is it, clear controls of silage effluent? Or if we get this heavy rain tonight, does our soiled water mix with dirty yards, mixed with effluent, mixed with slurry, mixed with clean water, all murking into the one big pool that's adding to volumes and that's adding then to to pressure when it comes to storage facilities, and that's adding to cost ultimately when that has to be dealt with at the other end. So I suppose the one thing I would say about all the different areas on the farm, we need to have it clearly defined. Where's dirty? What's dirty should be dirty and stored. Where's clean, that needs to be got away and diverted. Clear lines of differentiation between all of these if we're going to be able to manage them and control them well. And I suppose, even think about the farmyard in terms of clean water and where it's, how it's handled and has it been dealt with correctly. So if you take a medium-sized dry stock farm, as I have shown you here on this, and we try to itemize out roof water. So clean rainfall that forms on those roofs over the weekend, for example, how has it been dealt with? Is it been taken out of that yard as quickly and efficiently as possible without it contaminating other areas that need to be stored? For example, in this yard, we're looking at a mixture of ways that that's been handled. Some of that roof water has been piped underground to the surface drain network. It's not coming in contact with soiled yards or slurry storage. It's taken away directly to a clean water outfall, and that's ideal. Some of that yard is being taken away and going to a soakaway. Again, it's not mixing or contaminating any other soil water area or slurry storage. So we've managed to eliminate, and this is what really needs to happen, managed to eliminate clean roof water out of the scenario so that it's not adding to volumes. And that's something that everybody can do even now this weekend or next weekend is continually look at gutters and downpipes, because they need to be continually looked at. It's not just as simple as fix once during the year and that's it for 12 months. So I would urge, everyone to kind of continually keep an eye on that and make sure that that rainwater is being diverted. If you take this small, and it's not a big yard by any means, but the roofed area there accounts for about 25% of that whole yard complex. This yard, if it's in Kildare, if we add up the rainfall at 18 millimetres per week on the 1,300 square metres of roofed area that's there, that's approximately 5,000 gallons of rainfall per week falling on that yard. So if there isn't a clear plan in place, potentially there's 5,000 gallons going into slurry tanks or soil water tanks on a weekly basis. And now we begin to see how that creates problems with slurry storage or lack of capacity in situations where there probably is capacity, but it's now just been taken up by something that doesn't need to be collected. I think more so what ASSAP advisors are seeing out on farms is that this is continually a problem. And that it's something that really is interfering long-term with our ability to manage and spread nutrients as we'd like to do. So whether it's drainage network, whether it's a soak away, or whether it's rainwater harvesting systems, the key has to be about separating those, not allowing them to mix or contaminate or add to volumes that need to be stored. I suppose, hand in hand with that, and this feeds into actions 3 and 4 from the campaign, is about monitoring, what slatted tanks or slurry storage you have on the farm you have on it at this day. You're not going to be able to create anything else overnight. But what I would ask or suggest is that we monitor those slurry tanks or slurry facilities that are in the yard, see how fast they're filling. Are they filling quicker than they should be? And if they are, ask yourself why. Don't just say, oh, the tank is filling quick. Why is it? Is it that there's leaking pipes or water trucks dripping into them continually over the winter period? And if so, that's an easy fix. It's just to, if you're not aware and if you don't look, that might escape you. So it's, to monitor how fast they're filling to see, is there an issue like that? Or is it that in the last slide, as I've said, that there's clean water filling into those tanks that don't necessarily need to go there? Or more so, I think, and probably what we might see over the weekend, is it that there's rain actually getting into those tanks in yards from outside the farmyard, so coming in from field areas. So the picture I put up there depicts what it's taken from catchments.ie website, which a lot of you might be familiar with, but where we look at the flow of water over land. When land is saturated, when we get heavy rainfall, where does it flow? What's the path of flow? And if it is that that flow comes into a yard, then in heavy rainfall, we can see tanks filling up with rainwater ingressing off fields. And that, again, is something that we can address relatively simply by something that can even be done, at any day during the winter. Put in some class of a protection, some class of an earthen bund or a bank to divert away rainfall off of yards and prevent it from coming into those tanks and into that yard and adding to problems. And I think one of the good things about the winter is that we can see that, we can look and see that happening, and you can address it. It mightn't be so easy to see it during the summer, but certainly, have a look around the yard this weekend when that heavy rainfall does come and see the path of water and see whether it is coming in from roadways or fields around the yard and adding to problems. Because ultimately, something like that is feeding into our ability, to provide storage for what we need, and then to be able to spread when we want. We don't have that luxury if those tanks are filling with water that shouldn't be there. I suppose, the next thing, I suppose, is dealing with other areas around the farm. If we've taken the clean rainwater out of the scenario, and if we've avoided any water ingressing off fields and yards and roadways, what about soiled areas on the yards itself? So I suppose what I'm talking about here are areas that animals are accessing, feeding yards, open areas where soiled water is being created. I suppose, potentially there's huge volumes here as well due to rainfall. But the difference here is that this is very pollutant material and has a huge potential to pollute if it gets into our water courses. So it must be collected and it must be stored. But I'm going to ask you, to think about how can we minimize those areas? Do we have to allow animals access, and do they have to be soiled areas? It's about minimizing these as much as we possibly can. But I think what we've seen in ASSAP when we go out to farmyards is that sometimes it's not clear where these open soiled areas begin and end. It could be as simple as channels being needed or bunded being needed to ensure that they don't also collect clean water, and likewise that those soiled areas don't expand out into clean areas. So I think the key here is about having clear differentiation between what is soiled and what is cleaned, minimizing those areas and then collecting and control them. And I would just mention that management can play a very, very big part here in this. If you think about handling areas around farms, so cattle handling areas and crushes that are really in some places only very occasionally used during the winter. Do we really manage those as we should? So the question I'm asking is, when you're finished using that handling yard, is it cleaned off immediately? Is it washed off? Is it left back as a clean area? Or is it, in a lot of cases, it's left there, the intention is to clean it, but it doesn't happen. And then those handling yards continue to be a source of soiled water over the weeks that come. So management and hygiene, for want of a better word, but management to return occasionally used yards to clean status so that at least they could be eliminated. But besides that, I think it's an area we really need to focus on is differentiating what's soiled, what's clean, and not letting one roll over and into the other. I suppose one of the other areas that we really find can be a big problem on yards over winters are silage pits. And, as I said, photos can paint 1,000 words here, but really where you have silage pits and effluent channels that are not working 100%, there can be a huge problem around effluent being leaked out over channels and contaminating otherwise clean yards. And potentially, you'll see that last picture I've shown you, there, potentially large areas of otherwise clean yards can be contaminated when you look at effluent breaching out over channels and into those. So it's an area we really have to be conscious of. And even in that last picture I've shown you, even where silage pits are being managed really well and kept clean, even at this stage of the year, there can still be silage effluent weep from those silage pits. So can we call these clean areas? No, we can't. I mean, if there's effluent coming off that, then that must be controlled regardless of what time of the year is. Because if that gets to a surface water drain at the side of the yard, then really, we're at a lost cause. That's huge potential there to cause problems down along the road. So I suppose my message is very clear on this one. It's keep effluent channels clear, keep them working, and ensure that effluent is controlled. Effluent is not just a summer activity. It can still be there throughout the winter. So be vigilant and really watch and see where that's going. And I suppose also, like in terms of reducing losses, the action 5, reducing losses from the yard, management of those silage pits when they're open and when they're being fed out during the winter is another huge one we see regularly as being a problem. If we just focus maybe on the picture on the right-hand side here, okay, there might not be effluent coming out of that pit, but if you're using a silage pit and you're not cleaning it off, there's waste silage, there's silage dropping from the front loader, there's silage around where a diet feeder has been filled, for example, then all of that area now potentially becomes an area that's creating volumes and huge volumes of soiled water. So, how often do you clean your silage pit? How do you maintain it clean? How are you doing that? Is it with a yard scraper or a yard brush and bucket? What's happening to the waste silage? Do you have a place to go with it? Or is it also been stored on a silage slab? Because if it is, that's another soiled area that needs to be collected. So really, I think focus, all isn't lost. A lot of pits aren't, we'll have a lot of feeding to do before next spring, but the management that you put into keeping those silage pit areas and aprons clean will be hugely important in reducing losses off the farmyard. So that's one we can really double down on, I think, over the next couple of months. And I suppose then, if we've dealt with silage pits, we've dealt with slurry tanks, clean water, and roof rainwater and soil water, what's left? Well, there are areas in all our yards which are not soiled areas. They're not dirty yards, but are they really clean areas either? So I'm thinking here of areas where maybe there's a lot of machinery traffic on. Maybe there's milk tanks coming in and out of, meal lorries coming in and out of, jeeps, tractors. So maybe no organic material on them, but they're not necessarily clean areas either. And I think the key here that we're trying to get to focus on is that those areas should not be piped directly to a surface water drain. Okay, there's a lot of sediment here. There's a lot of potential for that sediment to have a bit of nutrient bound to it. The sediment itself can create problems when it gets into a drainage network. And really what we're talking about is trying to filter out some of that heavier sediment before the water moves on. So even think about how it's been handled on the farm. Is there a way of putting in a bit of a silt trap or a sediment trap to try and filter out some of the heavier material, or go to a percolation area with it? I think longer term, we need to figure out how we handle these areas, because there are lots of them on every farm, regardless of enterprise. But for today's purpose, I would say, look, the focus is try not to direct those directly to a drain. Try to do some amount of intervention between the yard and the drain to allow as much of that to settle out as possible and reduce the potential that could cause down the line. And I suppose, when you leave the farmyard, then we really have to go and see what's the first line of defense after the farmyard. And I think the first line that we look at is the drains that surround our farms. So really, I suppose what I'm talking about here is the drainage network. When you take those manholes and gullies that are in farmyards, what are they collecting? And looking at where they end up. So look into that drain that's close to the yard, investigate it, get down into it, look at it, see that is there discoloration, see is there a smell, see is there evidence of material other than water getting into it. If you see something in that drain that looks or smells off, then you need to follow it back to where that originates in the yard and see what's getting in there that shouldn't be. So the message here is to look to where your yard is connected to the drainage network now during the winter and see what those drains tell you. I suppose then, moving on again into, thinking we're moving further away from the farmyard possibly, but thinking more about the spring and 2025, I think a really important thing we could be looking at during the winter is thinking about our slurry and how we're going to use it next spring. This comes back to actions 1 and 2 in the 8 actions for change, about soil fertility and reducing our reliance on chemical nitrogen. Thinking about something like testing your slurry. It's very easy to either go a simple hydrometer to measure the dry matter of your slurry, or to go further and get it analysed in a lab. But to really get a handle on the nutrient content that's in the slurry on your own farm. That's a photograph I took at a farm walk a couple of years ago with 3 slurry samples in 3 containers. They looked very similar. From looking at the containers, you would say there was no difference. Yet when we used the hydrometer on it, we could see that one had a sample of 2% dry matter, one had a sample of 4%, and one had a sample of 7% dry matter. So there's a huge, huge difference. And we know that the dry matter directly influences the nutrient content. So potentially those 3 slurry samples that we're looking at went from 2 to 7% dry matter. There was a tripling in the content of phosphorus and potash, and almost 2.5 times the amount of available nitrogen across those. So I suppose what I'm suggesting here is that look at that slurry that's in those tanks. Either contact a lab if you want to do an analysis of it, or an advisor if you want to get a quick idea of what dry matter is there, put a value on it, but use the results then. Target the results. Use this slurry really, really conscientiously then and tie it back to its content, so that we're really kind of trying to balance the demand and supply there and make best use of what we do have firsthand in the farm. I suppose just moving on, as I said at the start, it's not that we expect anyone to be going out sowing cover crops at the minute on farms, but there are a lot of catch and forage crops. They're on farms at the minute. And I think, one of the things we need to look at is how they're being fed and out and managed over the winter period. We do know that cover crops have huge, huge potential to reduce the amount of nitrate leached on tillage farms. But as I said, from the point of view of how they're managed, potentially they're a very, very useful tool to have for a livestock farmer, but they need to be managed correctly. And when I say managed, it's like, are we conscious about moving feeders, not poaching land, not allowing compaction to take place? Is there sufficient liebacks? Is there reduce the amount of impact that machinery can have going in and out of those fields? Are we moving stock regularly? Are we very conscious about where water troughs are located? All of those things we can do this winter now. We can be more conscientious, more cognizant around how these areas are managed, because I said they're very, very valuable, but if they're managed poorly, they can be a huge source of sediment and nutrient loss into water courses around us, and that's something we want to try and avoid. And similarly, I suppose, when we talk about outwintering in general, and there is, there will be areas where outwintering will be practiced this winter, we need to apply common sense. So common sense to where we're locating feeders, where we're locating water troughs, how damaged the land is allowed to become, moving stock to prevent poaching. There is a huge, huge risk associated with this if it's done incorrectly. So it's just to remind ourselves that, a small bit of management and effort here will reduce that loss. And I suppose, in terms of, I know we're in the middle of winter, but I just did want to mention, in terms of preparing for the spring, it's really not that far away. And now that most stock are inside in yards, it's a really good time to look at the infrastructure that's around our yards. Roadways aren't being used, have a look at them. See where those roadways do need remedial works to prevent runoff into drains. It's very easy to see it now. I'm not saying it needs to be done now, but it needs to be planned that this work be completed before livestock start moving back out again in just a few weeks' time. So repairing roadways, using something like water bars to divert rainfall on roadways out into fields rather than allowing it into the drainage network, looking at where our water troughs and bridges and bunding is located. Now's the time to think about planning. What do I need to change for next spring? Because we all know spring is such a busy time on farms. It's very, very difficult to do all of these things all immediately before livestock starts moving out of sheds. Plan on it now. Grazing 25 is only a few weeks away. At least get some plan in place of how that work will be done before next grazing season. And I suppose, when you talk about that infrastructure, things like bunded drains next to roadways are a really simple but really effective tool in minimizing the amount of nutrient loss of roadways, of directing it to some place that it can be managed. Simple drain, bunded off and allowed to vegetate up, will hold a lot of sediment and prevent it from causing another problem down the road if it's to get to water courses. That's something simple that can be done on a lot of farms, but now's the time to have a look and see how they need to be handled. The other thing I would encourage everyone to do is to investigate their farms. It's easy to look at farms during the summer, but when soils are saturated now and we're getting heavy rain, have a look and see what way water is flowing across fields. Take the path of how it's, at the path of where it's ending up, particularly on tillage fields. Look at where there's low covers, see what's happening in our soils. Is there a loss of soil or sediment running to particular areas on the field? See how connected our fields are to the water courses around them, or the other way of putting it, how protected are our water courses from the activities that we're carrying on in the fields. Now is a really, really good time to do that when we do have unfavourable weather conditions, rather than leaving it until the summer, when in general we don't see these things. And I suppose the other thing, being aware of is that, we are in a really, really good time now when it comes to planting things like trees or hedges. I mean, if you look at that photograph on the left-hand side, who wouldn't want that on their farm? Beautiful stream, lovely bit of natural woodland around it, really good riparian margin. And you'd have to say that that stream is really well protected from the farming activity that's going on either side of it. But a lot of places that won't happen by accident. So now is the time, if you do want to establish some bit of a wooded area, some bit of hedges, hedging, trees. Now's the time to do it. And it's a really, really useful thing to do. I think it's something we all like to see in its fruition. It takes a bit of work and effort now at this time. And I suppose one of the other things I would ask you to plan for in the spring is the 6th action in the 8 actions is about fencing off of our water courses. Again, there's nobody going to go out this week and weekend and fence, but now's the time to think and plan for the spring, because when we do fence off these water courses, we too tend to get a lovely regeneration of kind of what's a natural habitat in those areas. And when you think about what that can develop into over time, it's something I think is of value to us all, not just from improving water quality, but what it's adding to the whole farm in terms of biodiversity and wildlife and habitat. So, plan on that fence and identify areas that you need to either repair, increase, or add to before the springtime. And I suppose one of the last things I want to mention is, now is the ideal time. We always hear about soil sampling and nutrient management planning for the spring, but whilst it is, I'm always a bit hesitant. People tend to do the first step. We tend to go and take our soil samples. Do we get to the second step of doing a nutrient management plan and looking at it? But I would actually suggest that probably where we need to start is looking at last year's nutrient management plan. Don't worry about next year's first. Let's think about last year's one. And did you address what it showed? So, if it identified that you need 30 or 40 tons of lime, did that actually go out? So don't get ahead of ourselves, I suppose, in planning for next year. We need to review last year first and then tuck into, okay, I do need some soil samples updated, or I do need a new nutrient management plan. There's new land there, or whatever the case may be. It is certainly one that's on the list that we do need to do over the winter in advance of next spring. I suppose my last slide is really that if you do have any downtime over the next couple of weeks, there are lots of different support and information available out there. So whether it's the ASSAP program or the Farming for Water EIP, whether it's looking up websites, the likes of catchments.ie, there's a lot of information there. And I think it's to encourage that we all need to upskill ourselves regularly. We all do, but it's to use what is available and the tools that are out there to our advantage. So just finally, I'd just like to say that the facilities that you have in your farm this weekend are what you have for this winter. It's unlikely that you're ever going to be able to change those massively. And those facilities are incredibly important. They are like a padlock to keep everything safe, all the nutrient, all the material that's there in the yard. But management is the key. You could have the best farmyard in the country. If you don't manage it well, it could potentially be a problem. And likewise, you might not have the facilities that you would like to, but if you manage them well, you can ensure that your farm and your farmyard is not contributing to a water quality problem in the area. So I'd like to leave it at that, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Excellent slides and very clear and concise messages there. So I think people appreciate that, and a lot to work with. And it's interesting you say that looking at this time of the year, what can be done at this time of the year. And you mentioned riparian buffer zones. I found a very nice fact sheet there on riparian buffer zones from the Teagasc website. I just shared it with people. Have you any advice that you could offer to people in that regard, or where could they get further advice on the planting of riparian zones?
Yeah, I suppose my first piece of advice is sometimes we tend to look at new areas or creating something new. And just listening to Catherine Keane, our countryside management specialist, she would always say that look to what you have first and retaining it and improving it rather than looking to do something completely new. Now, that's not to put the dampers on anyone who is optimistic or, is enthusiastic, but sometimes I think better focus of what we do have and maybe increasing it. So if there is an area or a corner on the farm, can you extend it out or make it bigger or larger, and just ameliorating it rather than looking for something completely new. But going back to that, there are lots of information there on the Teagasc website about habitats and biodiversity and creating corridors and linking different areas together. And the good thing I see, Mark, is that a lot of the positives for biodiversity and nature on the farm are also positives for water quality. Because so we can piggyback here, there can be, dual benefits across both water quality and biodiversity.
And if a farmer does want to maybe seek some further advice on plans that they might have, where would you direct them to?
I think initially I would probably ask them to look at the likes of their BIS maps in conjunction with their advisor, because that's already identifying beneficial areas on the farm. I think I would ask them to look to, if they're in acres, for example, to look at their acres plans and what measures put in there. But to then go looking at things like the teagasc.ie website and have a look up under the biodiversity and nature to get a feel for what is natural, native, and even information like native hedgerow species, native tree species that we know will fit in, as opposed to looking at something that's completely foreign and not suitable to our environment at all.
Talked about, and I know silage pits and can be a controversial enough area about what is clean or how clean is clean and so on. But those ones with the diversion chambers in them, is that still being installed? I mean, I know that can be an issue on some farms where they're not correctly set in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, silage pits have even silage pits, Mark, that are managed well, have such a potential to be a massive issue should something go wrong. So I suppose what we're really saying is, even in well-managed silage pits and silage aprons, where every effort is being put in by farmers to maintain them as clean areas with no contact with organic material at all, even they should not be directed directly to a surface water drain. Because in doing that, there is absolutely no safeguard in place should something go wrong. So even, where you have channels, where you have diversion in place, don't go directly to a surface water drain. There's nothing there to trap or stop any class of nutrient getting to the drain should something go wrong. So that's really, it's okay, absolutely manage them as best you can to keep them clean. But within that, there has to be some other way of diverting those to a sediment trap, a sediment tank, a silt trap, say the likes of the willow filter beds, but not to go directly to a drain. It's just too big a risk to take should something go wrong in those areas.
And just looking at the polluting potential, I know we used to look at the potential of the different liquids or effluents coming off the farm, and I know silage effluent. I think was it silage effluent and milk were two of the most polluting of all of the discharges from farms. Is that still the
Correct.
case?
Yeah, you're correct. And following on from that, like soiled water from dairy, from milking parlours and dairies, and that rainfall on those silage pits have the potential to carry huge levels of BOD, which is what you're talking about, and nutrients. So it really is, it's a case of managing them as absolutely to keep them clean and eliminate anything escaping. But really, do you want to take the risk that if there's a wet night tonight, and there is a bit of rainfall on an open silage pit, even if that area is kept clean, we cannot take the risk that water diverted straight from that directly to a drain is going to be 100% clean. It's the potential for to do damage is too great. So we have to try to eliminate that direct connection at all times with any of those materials. The potential for harm is just too great.
And presumably, and look, this what I took from your presentation was just try and get clean water away from the farmyard as best as possible. If I have if I have a roofed area and clean water coming off that roofed area, is it permissible to divert that directly to a drain or a water body?
Yeah, so I suppose this is exactly what we want to happen is rainwater that's fallen on roofs is uncontaminated. It doesn't come in contact with anything, with any nutrient on the yard. So really what we want to do is to get that away immediately. So diverting that to, if there's a surface water drain there around the yard, diverting it immediately to there or to a soak away. But unfortunately, Mark, it's not, like I say in the presentation, it's not something that once it's done once, that's it for the next 12 or 24 months. It continually needs work because you'll see a storm this weekend and there'll be branches fall or there'll be damage done, and suddenly you go out next week and there's a gutter and a downpipe down. And what was diverted away is now ending up in a concrete yard and there's no soakage, and then it makes its way to a soiled water tank or a slurry tank. So it's something that we need to continually monitor, not just, once a week and say it's done. And unfortunately, when we go into yards, we would often see, on paper that there's sufficient storage here in the yard, and we should have no problem in getting right through the close period and into the end of January. But the reality doesn't match that. And when you look at what's happening in the yard, it is things like roof water not being diverted away, ending up on yard and ending up filling tanks that's really, really valuable from slurry storage point of view, but now it isn't there because there's rainwater diverted into it. So it's old fashioned, it's not, very high tech, but it doesn't go away. Diverting that clean water away and not allowing it to eat into your valuable slurry storage is one of the major things we need to constantly keep an eye on.
Excellent, excellent. Noel, some very interesting questions coming in there.
Yeah, some very good questions coming in, and lots of compliments for the presentation that you gave, Fiona, coming in as well. I suppose maybe a couple of ones around the actual mitigation actions, and you mentioned around diverting that, I suppose, grey water, maybe is what we call it, the clean, dirty water in the yards that gets diverted off into kind of before they go to the drain, maybe putting in a bunded drain or a percolation area or willow bed area. So maybe if you could expand on that, because there's a question there around the need for plan permission for these, but I think what we're doing is putting in nature-based solutions here. So maybe just expand on the from an ASSAP point of view, what we'd be recommending for a farmer, that kind of scenario.
Sure. Yeah. So I suppose to preface this by saying what I'm not talking about now is controlling soiled water. We know what we need to do with it. It's covered under regulation, and that's very clear. But what I am talking about is areas around the yards that are they're not soiled water. They're simply trafficked over, maybe, as I said, by cars or lorries or machinery traffic coming in and out, that it's not clean water that we would be happy setting into the closest stream. So is there something that we can do in between to allow, if there's a bit of sediment, bit of mud, bit of wheels of tractors, bit of stones, grate, the like of that? And this is where our nature-based solutions come into it. So there are physical parts of infrastructure that we can put in place to reduce to allow some of that material to settle out. So for example, in its simplest form, something like a silt trap or a sediment tank. Most of us will remember what old septic tanks look like, with 2 and 3 chambers to allow material coming into it to give it time to settle down and settle out those heavier parts, and then flow on to second and third chambers and so on. So that's, that's a measure that's that can be used with that material coming off those grey yards to allow it to settle before water passes on. In conjunction with that, something like willow filter beds to allow that material to flow over an area, to allow a plant like willow to take up any nutrient that might be in it, or simply to polish off that water before it makes its way onto a percolation area. So we're very clear now, we're not looking at trying to control soil water. That's we know what we need to do with that in the yard. But this grey water, as you've called it, how can we put in extra safety measures in place to ensure that it's not taking anything with it to the water, to the closest water course? So, as I said, vegetated bunded drains, as I showed there, willow filter beds, sediment traps and silt traps are all measures that can be used in that scenario. And just, I suppose, to give people some extra information, the farmingforwater.ie website, Farming for Water EIP, which I didn't mention today, but their website does contain details on those measures. They are funded under the EIP if you're in an area that's eligible, so it's possibly worth looking at those and to see some of those could be employed on your farm.
Yeah, and it's the percolation area, it can be just over a field. We're not talking about constructing one like we would have for a septic tank. So it's just
no, percolate away over land, yeah.
And then I suppose there's another one there, a question in, see what you think of this. An old drain that's overgrown with trees and bushes, should it be cleaned, or should it be left in situ?
My response is very clear on this. Why do you need to clean it? If it's overgrown and there's vegetation there, if it's not causing a problem, then I don't. If it's not a problem, cleaning it out might actually only cause a problem, because we have to be very careful in reminding ourselves that one of the issues we have with water quality is the release of sediment and huge sediment build-up in our water courses. So while some maintenance is essential, keeping it to a minimum is also important. So if those overgrown drains are not causing a problem, I'm inclined to leave them there. If they are causing a problem, is to do the minimum amount possible, and to ensure that in doing that, you're minimizing the amount of sediment that's actually been allowed forward into a bigger drain that's connecting to that, and so on.
Yeah, and that'll be particularly relevant in kind of highly sensitive areas like acres cooperation project areas up in the hills where sediment is having a big impact on the high status water. So that'd be very important there. A couple of, just one or two more there for you, Fiona. The riparian area. I suppose you mentioned about planting on it, but I suppose maybe elaborate on that. Does it always have to be planted, or can it be allowed naturally regenerate? Or does it need to be maintained?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can remember, one of nearly the last picture I put up in that presentation, there was a nice little stream, and both sides seemed to have lovely trees after kind of coming into it, both sides shaded area. That was actually on foot of just fencing off that water courses. So you don't necessarily need to go in and plant a hedge or trees. Simply the act of fencing off and allowing a margin to allow up the natural vegetation that comes itself. And over time, that photograph actually developed over time. Those trees naturally occur. So it's not a case of having to go in and intervene. I suppose that comes back to Mark's point earlier on. It's on building on whatever's there and allowing that natural regeneration, whether it's just grasses and vegetation that's low to the ground, or eventually kind of the likes of birch and alder that will re-establish themselves.
Yeah, very good. And I suppose there's a couple of come in around roads, and not necessarily farm roads, more public roads, and the influence they have, and the impacts they can have on land and water quality and so on. And I suppose the same principles apply to the county, or should apply to the county councils that apply to farmers with regards to diversion and so on. Protection of not piping directly into rivers and that. Would that be your thoughts on it, Fiona?
Yeah, I suppose it is something that comes up in certain areas where farmers are close to to major roads or towns or villages, and I suppose my answer is that, when water quality is looked at and assessed, there are lots of different pressures. It's not just agriculture. I know we're talking about agriculture today. It's not just agriculture. And your urban wastewater treatment plants and urban runoff are monitored. They are in there as pressures too. So, that does take in the local authorities and Irish Water and all these other organisations into it as well. And they are monitored and looked at. I suppose the issue I have is that we need to focus now on ourselves. So that's notwithstanding the fact that there are other problems out there and they do need to be looked at. We only have control of what's inside our own farm gates, and we have to really focus on that to get results for ourselves. Let everyone else look after themselves.
And I suppose maybe a final one before I hand back to Mark, just, there's a lot of uncertainty maybe out there for some farmers with regards to what's going to happen in 5 years, in next year and the year after with regards to irrigations and so on. And there's probably a little bit of wait and see going on and maybe, what's going to happen. Have you any advice for those farmers that might need to do something, from the point of view of not necessarily additional storage, but better management and maybe putting in some facilities to help that? Have you any advice for those guys that might be, a little bit procrastinating a little bit because they're not sure what's going to happen to them, Yeah.
Yeah, I do. And that's a conversation ASSAP advisors have regularly with farmers. But I think if you look at the things I've pointed to this morning, all of those measures, they're not massive, big, costly investment. We're talking about things that will actually, quite easy inside in farmyards, that will reduce time, will reduce labour, and make the yard and the farm run more efficiently. And I think that's key. Those measures will not only, make sure that there's better efficiency in the slurry that we do have, but it'll reduce time and energy and money been spent on spreading, which essentially is clean rainwater in yards, mixing with tanks, causing problems down along the line. So even, there's simple measures there that can be a win-win. They will make the farm more efficient, reduce time, reduce cost on spreading water and such like, whilst also improving the chances of improving water quality. So let's not get blinded by the big headline figures. There are things there that are very doable and very cost efficient that will make a difference with, right here and right now.
Absolutely. I think get the basics right, Fiona, I think is
get
the basics right. Okay, Mark. Yeah.
Fiona, you mentioned about getting your slurry tested. Is that expensive, or how would one go about doing that?
Yeah, so in its simplest forms, many of the Teagasc advisors, I know ourselves here in Kildare, have access to slurry hydrometers and can do a dry matter, almost instantly once a farmer has a sample agitated. But getting it done in the lab is also equally as easy to do. Again, it's just said about identifying what lab you're going with, getting the bottle to put the sample into, and making arrangements like that. And it actually is a measure that's covered under the Farming for Water EIP as well. So it's very easy to do, and it will give you a much more accurate reading of what you're producing on your farm. So it's not that it's costly. I suppose it's the prep and just getting organised to do it, Mark. But very achievable on every farm, and that's something I think everyone should do once over the winter at least.
And is that Farming for Water EIP? Is that available to all farmers?
It's not. I suppose the Farming for Water EIP is it's a focused EIP. There are areas in the country which are eligible to apply, areas which have been identified as having issues with water quality and where agriculture is a pressure. For anyone who's interested in looking into it further and seeing are they in an eligible area, I suggest that they look up the website farmingforwater.ie, which will give them an idea of their eligibility, and I'll give them the contact details and an idea of the measures that are covered under it.
Very good. Well, Fiona, we're just out of time. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. As Noel said, lots of compliments coming in through the Q&A system there. So really, really appreciate it. Very timely as well, given that we are entering that fairly high water volume time of the year, and especially this weekend. So I suppose the advice to everyone is even this evening to check your downpipes and gutters, and if you have time to maybe just check that everything is in order. So thanks again, Fiona. Next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. Niall Farrelly, who is a senior forestry researcher with Teagasc, and he's going to be discussing climate adaptation in forestry. So we're looking forward to hearing Niall's presentation next week. In the meantime, I just want to say thanks to Noel, again to Fiona, and also to Yvonne Maher in the background, who's helping with the technical side and has been sending you some links through the chat there, which I hope you find useful. So do join us next week, and we hope you all get to enjoy the toy show tonight. It's hard to believe it's that time of the year. So until next week, take care, and we will hope you have a safe and enjoyable weekend.